What happens when the web of lies we've spun threatens to unravel everything we've built? Will love survive the fallout? Or will the truth destroy us all? Before we dive into this gripping story, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more emotional journeys like this one, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Marcus stood in the doorway, arms crossed, leaning slightly as though he'd caught me in the middle of something illicit. His expression was calm, almost amused, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity that made my stomach churn. "I saw what you did," he said, his voice low, the words slicing through the charged silence. I froze, unable to find my voice. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what he meant, though deep down I already knew. Earlier that day, our house was a picture of celebration. Guests milled around with glasses of champagne in hand, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Dan, my husband, the star of the evening, moved through the crowd like a politician, shaking hands and receiving congratulations for turning his late father's struggling company into a $100 million empire. I stood near the edge of the room, smiling politely, holding a glass I hadn't touched. My dress clung to me in all the right places, but I felt invisible. Even tonight, a night meant to celebrate all we'd built together, Dan's focus was elsewhere. His words to me were few, his touches brief. When he finally approached, it was to introduce me to someone I'd already met twice. "You're glowing tonight," Marcus said as he approached, his voice cutting through the polite monotony of small talk. I turned, startled by his sudden appearance. Dan's younger brother had always carried an air of easy charm, the kind that made him seem both approachable and slightly dangerous. He wasn't as polished as Dan, but that was part of his appeal. While Dan lived in tailored suits and business jargon, Marcus seemed more at home in leather jackets and sarcasm. "I'm just trying to survive this night," I replied, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "You're doing more than surviving," he said, his gaze lingering a moment too long. "You look incredible." I felt my cheeks flush. It wasn't the first time Marcus had complimented me, but tonight, something about it felt different. There was a heat behind his words, a boldness that made me both nervous and exhilarated. "I should get back," I said, breaking the moment. "Dan will be looking for me." But when I turned to leave, his voice stopped me. "Does he even see you anymore?" Later, as the party wound down, Dan disappeared into his office to take yet another call. I wandered through the house, gathering glasses and tidying up. Marcus found me in the kitchen, leaning casually against the counter as though he belonged there. "You work too hard," he said, watching as I loaded the dishwasher. "Someone has to," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. "Dan's busy enough for the both of us." Marcus smirked, his head tilting slightly as he studied me. "You always defend him, even when you don't mean it." I stiffened, unsure how to respond. He had a way of cutting through pleasantries, exposing truths I wasn't ready to admit, not even to myself. "Why are you here, Marcus?" I asked, turning to face him fully. He shrugged. "Just wanted to see if you needed help." "Fine," I said, but my voice wavered. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You don't look fine. You look tired." "Don't," I warned, but it came out as a whisper. Don't what?" he asked, his voice soft, teasing. "Don't tell you the truth? Don't remind you that you deserve more than being the afterthought in your own life?" I shook my head, but he kept coming closer until he was mere inches away. I could feel the heat radiating from him, his presence overwhelming. His hand lifted, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face, and I froze. "This isn't," I began, but the words died on my lips as his hand lingered, his thumb grazing my cheek. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice a low rumble. I couldn't. I wanted to, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, my breath hitching as he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a tentative, almost hesitant kiss. When I didn't pull away, he deepened it, his hand sliding to my waist. For a moment, I let myself forget about the company, the responsibilities, the distance that had grown between Dan and me. For a moment, it was just Marcus and the way he made me feel, seen, wanted, alive. But the moment ended as quickly as it began. I pulled back, my heart racing, my hands trembling as I pushed him away. This was a mistake, I said, my voice shaking. Marcus didn't argue or apologize. He simply looked at me, his expression unreadable. If you say so. He tilted his head, studying me with those piercing eyes. Why not? You don't have to pretend with me. I know you're not happy, and I know he's too busy playing the golden boy to notice. That's not fair, I snapped, though the words rang hollow even to me. Dan has worked hard for everything we have. He's doing this for us, for the life we've built. And where does that leave you? Marcus pressed, his voice soft but insistent. Alone in this big house, playing hostess to his success? The words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I turned away, busying myself with the coffee pot to avoid his gaze. You don't understand. You've never had to build something from scratch, to sacrifice for someone else. Maybe not, he said, his voice closer now. I hadn't heard him move, but when I turned, he was standing right behind me. But I know what it's like to want someone who makes you feel alive. I felt his hand brush against mine, a light touch that sent a jolt up my arm. I yanked my hand away, spinning to face him. Marcus, stop. Oui, Meta? He asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Tell me you didn't feel something last night. Tell me you don't want more. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, my heart pounding as his gaze bore into me. The air between us was thick, heavy with unspoken desires, and I can't, I finally managed, my voice breaking. This isn't right. Sometimes the right thing and the thing that makes you happy aren't the same, he said, stepping closer. I'm not asking you to leave him, I want to be here for you. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I hated how tempting they were, how easy it would be to let him in, to let him fill the void Dan had left behind. But I wouldn't go down that path again. You need to leave, I said, my voice firmer this time. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then he nodded, stepping back. Fine, he said, grabbing his coat. But this isn't over. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I tried to throw myself into anything that would distract me, cleaning, running errands, even reorganizing the pantry. But no matter what I did, my thoughts kept drifting back to Marcus, to the way he'd looked at me, the way his touch had lingered. By the time Dan came home, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He kissed me on the cheek as he walked past, already pulling out his laptop to review the day's numbers. Big meeting tomorrow, he said, not even looking up as he spoke. I'll be working late tonight. Of course you will, I muttered under my breath. What was that? He asked, glancing up briefly. Nothing, I said quickly, plastering on a smile. Do you want me to bring you dinner in your office? Sure, he said, already engrossed in his screen. I sighed, heading to the kitchen to prepare his plate. This had become our routine. Me playing the dutiful wife, him absorbed in work. I told myself it was just a phase, that once the company reached its peak, things would go back to how they used to be, but deep down I knew better. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of Dan's office fan down the hall. I turned over, clutching the pillow to my chest, trying to ignore the gnawing ache in my chest. A soft chime broke the silence. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, squinting at the screen. A message from Marcus. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the keyboard. I knew I shouldn't respond, that engaging with him would only make things worse. But the loneliness was unbearable, and his message was a lifeline I couldn't ignore. Yes. The reply came almost instantly. Come outside. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at the door, then back at the screen. He couldn't be serious. Could he? Curiosity and an inexplicable pull got the better of me. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound as I padded down the hall and out the front door. The night air was cool against my skin, a sharp contrast to the heat rising in my cheeks as I saw him leaning against his car at the end of the driveway. "What are you doing here?" I hissed, wrapping my arms around myself. "Couldn't sleep," he said with a shrug. "Thought you might be in the same boat." "This is insane," I said, glancing around nervously. "Dan is home." "And yet you're out here," he pointed out, a sly smile tugging at his lip. I opened my mouth to argue, but he held up a hand, cutting me off. "Relax. I'm not here to cause trouble. I needed to see you." His words sent a pang through my chest. I hated how much I wanted to believe him, how much I wanted to let him in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a line I couldn't afford to cross again. "You should go," I said, my voice trembling. "Is that what you really want?" he asked, stepping closer. I looked up at him, his face half hidden in the shadows. My heart was pounding, every instinct screaming at me to walk away, but I couldn't. Instead, I stood there, caught between what I knew was right and what I desperately wanted. "You're going to ruin everything," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Maybe it's already ruined," he said, his tone soft but laced with meaning. "Maybe I'm just giving you a way out." Marcus's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. A way out. I wanted to laugh, to tell him that whatever he thought this was, it wasn't some grand rescue. But the truth hit too close to home. He wasn't entirely wrong. Somewhere deep inside, I'd started wondering if I was trapped in a life I no longer recognized. "I don't need a way out," I said firmly, though my voice lacked conviction. "What I need is for you to respect my boundaries." He smirked, tilting his head as he studied me. "Your boundaries? Are those the same boundaries you crossed when you kissed me back last night?" Heat rose to my cheeks. "That was a mistake." "Funny thing about mistakes," he said, stepping closer. "They usually feel pretty good in the moment." I opened my mouth to respond, but found myself at a loss for words. Marcus had a way of stripping away my defenses, leaving me exposed and vulnerable in ways I wasn't prepared for. He stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You can keep telling yourself it's a mistake, but we both know the truth." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I hated how easily he could unsettle me, how his presence seemed to pull me into a vortex of emotions I couldn't control. I turned away, wrapping my arms around myself. "This has to stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Dan doesn't deserve this." Marcus's expression softened slightly, and for a moment I thought he might back off. But then he reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. "And what do you deserve?" he asked softly. The question hit me harder than I expected. What did I deserve? A husband who saw me? Who made me feel like more than just a piece of furniture in his carefully curated life? Or was that selfish, ungrateful even, given everything Dan had built for us? "I deserve peace," I said finally, a voice trembling, "and I won't find it in this." Marcus nodded slowly, his hand falling to his side. "Fair enough," he said, stepping back. "But if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." He turned and walked to his car, leaving me standing in the driveway, my heart pounding and my thoughts swirling. As his taillights disappeared down the street, I let out a shaky breath, wondering if I'd just made the right choice or the wrong one. The following days were a blur of routine. Dan buried himself in work as usual, leaving me to manage the house and the growing emptiness inside me. I avoided Marcus's calls and texts, though each one sent a ripple of temptation through me. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the bedroom, Dan walked in, his tie loosened and his face drawn with fatigue. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his temples. "Tough day?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded, not looking up. "The board is pressuring me about the expansion plans. They think I'm spreading us too thin." I set down the shirt I was folding and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You'll figure it out. You always do." He glanced up at me, his expression softening. "Sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it, all this work, all this stress. I'm doing it for us, but I feel like I'm losing you in the process." The admission caught me off guard. For the first time in months, it felt like he was seeing me, really seeing me. My throat tightened and I struggled to find the right words. "You haven't lost me," I said quietly. "I'm still here." His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more, something that would bridge the growing distance between us. But then his phone buzzed, and the moment was gone. He glanced at the screen, sighing as he stood. "I have to take this," he said, walking out of the room without another word. I sat down on the bed, the weight of his absence settling over me like a familiar ache. He might have been physically present, but emotionally he was miles away, and I didn't know how to reach him anymore. A week later, I found myself in the garden, pruning the rose bushes. The repetitive motion was soothing, a small escape from the chaos in my mind. I was so lost in thought that I didn't hear the gate. "Still avoiding me, I see," Marcus said, his voice startling me. I turned, my heart sinking as I saw him standing there, his hands in his pockets and a wry smile on his face. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. "Bax," he said, holding up his hands. "I'm just here to drop off something for Dan. Business stuff." I frowned. "You couldn't have emailed it." "Some things are better handled in person," he said, his tone casual. "Besides, I thought I'd check on you while I was here." "I don't need checking on," I said, turning back to the rose bush. "I'm fine." He chuckled, the sound low and warm. "You're a terrible liar." I clenched my jaw, refusing to rise to the bait. But Marcus wasn't one to let things go easily. "You can pretend all you want," he said, stepping closer, "but I know you, and I know you're not fine." I turned to face him, my anger flaring. "You don't know me as well as you think, Marcus. You don't know what I've been through, what I've sacrificed. Just tell me," he said, his voice softening. "Help me understand." His sincerity caught me off guard, and for a moment I considered opening up, letting him see the cracks beneath the surface. But then I shook my head, stepping back. "This isn't your business," I said firmly. "Dan is your brother. You should be supporting him, not whatever this is." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right," he said, surprising me. "But that doesn't mean I can just stop caring about you." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Before I could respond, the sound of the front door opening cut through the tension. Dan stepped outside, his expression neutral as he spotted us. "Marcus," he said, nodding and greeting. "What brings you here?" "Just dropping this off," Marcus said, holding up the envelope. He handed it to Dan, then glanced back at me. "I'll see you around." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with Dan's gaze fixed on me. I forced a smile, hoping he wouldn't notice the way my hands trembled. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual. "Of course," I said quickly, just catching up. But as Dan walked back into the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's presence had set something in motion, something I might not be able to stop. The park was quiet, the crisp autumn air filled with the scent of fallen leaves. Marcus was waiting by a bench near the edge of the lake, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mix of relief and something else I couldn't quite place. "I didn't think you'd come," he said as I stopped a few feet away. "Neither did I admitted, my voice soft. Marcus leaned closer, his voice soft but insistent. "Sometimes life isn't fair. Sometimes you just have to reach for what makes you happy." I looked up at him, my resolve weakening with every second. "And what happens when it all falls apart?" He smiled faintly, a touch of sadness in his eyes. "Maybe it doesn't have to." It was a beautiful lie, one I wanted desperately to believe, and in that moment, I let myself fall into it. Before I could second-guess myself, I closed the distance between us, pressing my lips to his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though we were testing the waters. But then his hand moved to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and the kiss deepened, became something I couldn't deny or control. When we finally broke apart, I couldn't bring myself to look at him. The reality of what I'd just done crashed down on me like a tidal wave. "I shouldn't have done that," I said, my voice trembling. "Don't," Marcus said, tilting my chin up so I had no choice but to meet his gaze. "Don't ruin this by overthinking it." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "This isn't who I am, Marcus. I don't cheat. I don't betray the people I love. And yet, here you are," he said softly, his thumb brushing a tear from my cheek. "Maybe it's time to stop running from what you really want." His words were intoxicating, dangerous. I wanted to believe them, to give in to the pull he had on me. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing guilt in the pit of my stomach, the knowledge that I was unraveling everything I'd spent years building. "I can't do this," I said, standing abruptly. "I need to go." "Wait," he said, grabbing my hand as I turned to leave. "Don't shut me out. You don't have to go through this alone." "That's great," I said, trying to sound enthusiastic. But the weight of what I'd done hung heavy between us, and I struggled to maintain eye contact. Dan seemed to sense something was off. He stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm. "Are you okay? You seem distant." "I'm fine," I said quickly, pulling away. "Just tired." He frowned but didn't press further. "Well, why don't you take it easy tonight? I can handle dinner." The offer surprised me. Dan rarely cooked, but the gesture was enough to stir a pang of guilt in my chest. He was trying in his own way, and here I was betraying him in the worst possible way. "Thanks," I said quietly, retreating to the bedroom before my emotions could betray me. The following days were agonizing. I avoided Marcus's calls and texts, burying myself in chores and errands to keep my mind occupied. Dan seemed more attentive than usual, going out of his way to spend time with me and asking about my day. It should have made me feel better, but instead it only amplified the guilt. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the bedroom, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was a text from Marcus. "We need to talk. It's important." I stared at the message, my heart pounding. I knew I shouldn't respond, but something about the urgency in his words made it impossible to ignore. "What is it?" I typed back, my fingers trembling. His reply came almost instantly. "Can you meet me? It's about Dan." My blood ran cold. What could he possibly know about Dan? Was this some kind of trap? Against my better judgment, I texted back, "Where?" When I arrived at the cafe, Mark was already there, sitting at a table in the corner. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. I sat down across from him, my stomach twisting with anxiety. "What is this about?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I wasn't going to say anything, but you need to know the truth." "About what?" I demanded, my patience wearing thin. "Don," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "He's been lying to you." I stared at him, my heart sinking. "What are you talking about?" found her voice pulling me back. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, finally meeting Marcus's gaze. "Why now?" "Because you deserve to know the truth," he said simply. I couldn't sit back and watch him lie to you anymore. I wanted to believe him, but a part of me couldn't help but question his motives. Marcus had always been unpredictable, and I couldn't ignore the possibility that this was his way of driving a wedge between Dan and me. "And what do you expect me to do with this information?" I asked, my voice sharp. "I don't expect anything," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I just thought you deserved to know the kind of man you're married to." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Coming from you? That's rich." Marcus flinched, but he didn't argue. Instead, he leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I know I'm not perfect, I know I've made mistakes, but this isn't about me. It's about you, and you deserve better than this." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment I let my guard down. But then the weight of everything crashed back down on me, and I stood abruptly, grabbing my bag. "I need to think," I said, my voice trembling. "Take all the time you need," Marcus said, his tone gentle. "But if you need someone to talk to, I'm here." I didn't respond. I turned and walked out of the cafe, my heart pounding and my mind racing. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face, but it did little to clear the storm inside me. The drive home was suffocating. Every mile felt heavier than the last, the silence in the car amplifying the chaos in my mind. When I pulled into the driveway, Dan's car was parked in its usual spot. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of anger surging through me. And then there was Marcus. I hadn't responded to his text since the cafe, but his words lingered in my mind. "You don't have to do this alone." As much as I hated to admit it, a part of me wanted to reach out to him, to lean on him in a way I couldn't with anyone else. By mid-afternoon, the tension became too much to bear. I grabbed my phone and typed out a message before I could second-guess myself. "Can we talk?" Marcus's reply came almost instantly. "My place, whenever you're ready." When I arrived at Marcus's apartment, he was waiting for me at the door. His expression was soft, almost cautious, as though he knew how fragile I felt. He stepped aside, letting me in without a word. The apartment was quiet, the dim lighting casting a warm glow over the space. I sat on the couch, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, as Marcus sat beside me, giving me space. "I saw the messages," I said finally, my voice breaking. "On his phone. He's been lying to me this whole time." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "You didn't deserve this." I let out a bitter laugh, tears streaming down my face. "And what about what I've done? I'm no better." "Don't do that," he said, his voice firm. "Don't compare what we have to what he's done. This isn't the same." I shook my head, the guilt and pain overwhelming me. "I don't know what to do, Marcus. I feel like my whole life is falling apart." He reached for my hand, his touch steady and reassuring. "Then let me help you pick up the pieces." I looked at him, the sincerity in his eyes breaking through the wall I'd built around myself. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way forward. And in that moment, I let myself lean into him, letting the weight of everything fall away. "Then let's find you again," Marcus said, his voice steady and calm. "You don't have to figure it all out at once, just take it one step at a time." His words were like a lifeline, and though I wasn't sure I believed them, I wanted to. I wanted to believe that I could rebuild, that I could find happiness again. But a small, nagging voice in the back of my mind reminded me that happiness often came with a price. When I got home that evening, the house was dark and quiet. Dan had left a note on the counter: "Dinner with clients, don't wait up." It was becoming his new signature move, a pattern I should have recognized sooner, but now the words felt like confirmation of everything I already knew. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the note. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Did you make it home okay?" "Yes." "Thanks for everything today," I replied, hesitating before adding, "I don't know what I'd do without you." His response was immediate. "You don't have to do it without me." I stared at the screen, his words echoing in my mind. Marcus had become a constant in my life, someone who made me feel seen and valued in a way Dan hadn't in years. But the lines between us were growing blurrier by the day, and I knew I was treading on dangerous ground. The next morning, I decided I couldn't keep living in limbo. I needed answers. I needed to hear the truth from Dan's own mouth. When he came home that evening, I was waiting for him in the living room. He seemed surprised to see me, his expression flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe? "Hey," he said, setting his briefcase down. "What's this? You look serious." "We need to talk," I said, my tone firmer than I expected. Dan frowned, sitting on the edge of the couch. "Okay, what's going on?" I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "I know about Christine." For a moment, his face went blank, and then his jaw tightened. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Dan," I said, my voice rising. "I saw the messages. I know you've been seeing her." His expression shifted, a mix of anger and panic. "You've been going through my phone?" "Don't turn this around on me," I snapped. "You're the one who's been lying to me. You're the one who's been cheating." Dan stood, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think," he said, his tone defensive. "Christine is just a friend." "A friend?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "Friends don't send texts like the ones I saw. I miss you, can't wait to see you again. Who are you trying to fool?" He opened his mouth to respond but stopped, his shoulders sagging as the fight seemed to drain out of him. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said quietly. It got complicated." "Complicated?" I said, shaking my head. "That's your excuse? Do you even realize what you've done? What you've destroyed?" "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, his voice almost pleading. "I was under so much pressure, and she was just there." I stared at him, my chest tightening with a mix of rage and heartbreak. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "You didn't think about me at all, Dan. You didn't think about our marriage or what we've built. You threw it all away for what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked away, his silence speaking volumes. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine." Dan looked at me, his eyes wide with panic. "Wait, you're not saying—" "I don't know what I'm saying," I interrupted, tears streaming down my face. "I just know I can't keep living like this." "Please, let's talk about this," he said, stepping closer. "We can fix this. I'll end things with Christine. I'll do whatever it takes." "It's too late for that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You already broke us." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him standing there in stunned silence. My heart felt like it was shattering with every step, but I knew I couldn't stay, not like this. That night, I packed a bag and drove to Marcus's apartment. When he opened the door and saw me standing there, his expression softened and he stepped aside to let me in without a word. "I told him," I said as I set my bag down. "I told him I know about Christine." "And?" Marcus asked, his tone cautious. "He wants to fix it," I said, shaking my head. "But I don't think I can." Marcus stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "Then don't," he said softly. "You don't owe him anything, not after what he's done." I looked at him, the weight of everything pressing down on me. "I don't know what to do." "Stay," he said simply, his voice steady. "Just for tonight. You don't have to decide anything right now." I hesitated, my heart pounding, but finally I nodded. For the first time in a long time, I let myself let go. And as Marcus pulled me into his arms, I realized I wasn't just running away from Dan. I was running towards something new. The quiet of Marcus's apartment was both comforting and unnerving. It was a stark contrast to the chaos I had left behind. As I sat on his couch, my bag resting on the floor beside me, Marcus handed me a glass of wine and took a seat across from me. He didn't press me to speak. I stared into the wine glass, watching the light play off its surface. "I don't even know who I am anymore," I said finally, my voice barely audible. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his tone steady. "You've just been pushed to your limit." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Strong? I don't feel strong. I feel lost. Like I've been living someone else's life and now it's all falling apart." "Maybe it needed to fall apart," Marcus said gently, "so you can rebuild something that's actually yours." His words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I had defined myself by my marriage, by the life Dan and I had built together. But that life wasn't mine anymore, not really. It was a facade, a carefully constructed image that no longer fit who I was. "What if I don't know how to rebuild?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What if I fail?" "You won't," Marcus said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Because you're not alone. I'm here, and I'll help you every step of the way." I looked up at him, his words wrapping around me like a lifeline. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way forward. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. For a moment, I didn't recognize where I was, the unfamiliar surroundings, the softness of the guest bed. It all felt surreal. But then the events of the previous night came rushing back, and the weight of reality settled over me once more. I sat up, running a hand through my hair. Marcus had insisted I take the guest room, promising he wouldn't overstep. True to his word, he'd been nothing but supportive, giving me the space I needed to process everything. When I stepped into the kitchen, I found him standing at the stove, flipping pancakes. He turned when he heard me, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm. "I hope you're hungry." I managed a small smile, sliding onto one of the bar stools. "I didn't know you could cook." "There's a lot you don't know about me," he said, winking playfully, "but I make a mean pancake." The light-hearted banter was a welcome distraction from the heaviness in my chest. For a few minutes, we fell into an easy rhythm, talking about nothing in particular as we ate. It was simple, comfortable, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. But the reprieve didn't last long. My phone buzzed on the counter, and when I saw Dan's name on the screen, my stomach twisted. "Are you going to answer it?" Marcus asked, his tone cautious. I stared at the phone, my finger hovering over the screen. Finally, I sighed and picked it up. "I have to." I stepped into the hallway, pressing the phone to my ear. Where are you?" Dan's voice was tight, edged with worry. "I woke up and you were gone. Your things are missing. What's going on?" "I needed some time," I said carefully. "I told you last night, I can't keep doing this." "You can't just leave," he said, his voice rising. "We're married, for God's sake. We're supposed to work through things together." "Together?" I repeated, my anger flaring. "You mean like how you worked through things with Christine?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Dan spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost pleading. "I made a mistake. I know that. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling, start over. I'll do whatever it takes." I closed my eyes, leaning against the wall. His words were everything I had wanted to hear for years, but now they felt hollow. It was too late. Too much had happened. I need more than words, Dan, I said finally. I need to figure out who I am, what I want, and I can't do that with you hovering over me. So, what? He asked, his voice breaking. You're just going to walk away? Throw everything we've built away? I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. I don't know what the future holds, but right now, I need space. Please, respect that. There was another long pause, and then Dan sighed heavily. Fine, take your space. But this isn't over. The line went dead, and I lowered the phone, my hand shaking. When I turned, Marcus was standing at the edge of the hallway, his expression unreadable. Are you okay? He asked softly. I nodded, though tears were already spilling down my cheeks. I don't know, I admitted, but I think I'm doing the right thing. Marcus stepped closer, his arms wrapping around me in a comforting embrace. You are, he said firmly, and whatever happens, I'm here for you. Over the next few days, I started to feel the weight lifting, little by little. Staying with Marcus gave me the space to think, to breathe, to figure out what I wanted. He never pressured me, never pushed for more than I was ready to give. Instead, he became my rock, my steady anchor in the midst of the chaos. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Marcus turned to me, his expression serious. Have you thought about what you're going to do next? I nodded, though the thought still terrified me. I think I need to file for separation, I said quietly. It's not fair to either of us to keep pretending things can go back to the way they were. Marcus reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. That's a brave decision. It doesn't feel brave, I admitted. It feels terrifying grief. That's how you know it's the right one, he said with a small smile. The best things in life are the ones that scare you. I looked at him, the sincerity in his eyes giving me strength. Thank you, I said softly, for everything. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you. You don't have to thank me, he said, his voice low. I'd do anything for you. The intensity in his gaze made my breath catch, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. Slowly he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft and tender, filled with unspoken promises. This time I didn't pull away. I let myself sink into the moment, into him, and for the first time in years, I felt whole. The kiss was everything I hadn't realized I'd been longing for, gentle yet deliberate, cautious yet filled with a passion that made my chest ache. Marcus didn't rush me. He let me set the pace, his hands resting lightly on my waist as if to remind me that I was in control. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. Are you okay? He asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though tears stung my eyes. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted, my voice trembling, but I know it feels right. Marcus cupped my cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. Then that's all. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to believe him. I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could find happiness again, even if it wasn't the way I'd imagined it. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the blinds, its warmth kissing my skin. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't wake up with a sense of dread. The weight that had been pressing on my chest had eased, replaced by a cautious optimism that felt foreign yet welcome. Marcus was already up, the faint clinking of dishes coming from the kitchen. I stretched, savoring the quiet moment before pulling myself out of bed and heading to join him. He stood at the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs, his hair still slightly tousled from sleep. Morning, he said with a smile when he saw me. Morning, I replied, taking the mug he offered. You're becoming quite the host. He chuckled, leaning against the counter. I like having you here." There was a sincerity in his tone that made my chest tighten. I sipped my coffee, unsure of how to respond. Marcus had become my safe space, my constant, but the reality of what lay ahead still loomed over me. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I hesitated, setting my mug down. "I need to go back to the house today," I said quietly. "There are things I need to sort out." "Do you want me to come with you?" he offered. I shook my head. "No, I need to do this alone, but thank you." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "If you need anything, you know where to find me." The drive to the house felt surreal, as if I were heading toward a life that no longer belonged to me. When I pulled into the driveway, the sight of Dan's car parked in its usual spot made my stomach twist. I wasn't ready for another confrontation, but the house was eerily quiet as I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. Dan was in the living room, his laptop open on the coffee table. He looked up when he saw me, his expression a mix of relief and apprehension. "You're back," he said, standing. "I wasn't sure if you would be." "I'm just here to pack some things," I said, my tone measured. "I thought it would be easier if I came while you were home." Dan's shoulders sagged, and he ran a hand through his hair. "Can we talk first, please?" I hesitated, my instincts telling me to keep my distance. But there was a part of me that needed closure, that needed to understand how we had ended up here. "Okay," I said finally, sitting on the edge of the couch. Dan sat across from me, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For a moment he didn't speak, as if searching for the right words. When he finally did, his voice was quiet. "I know I've hurt you," he said, "and I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try. I want to fix this." His words were everything I'd hoped to hear weeks ago before everything fell apart, but now they felt hollow. Too much had happened, too much had been broken, and I wasn't sure there was anything left to fix. "I don't know if we can," I said honestly. "You broke my trust, Dan, and without that, what do we have?" "We have years of memories," he said, his voice pleading. "We have a life together. Doesn't that mean something?" "It does," I said, my voice soft. "But memories aren't enough to rebuild a marriage." Dan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "Counseling, therapy, anything. Just tell me what you need." "I need time," I said, standing. "I need space to figure out what I want, who I am, and I can't do that here." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with desperation. "So that's it? You're just leaving?" "For now," I said, my voice firm. "This isn't goodbye forever. But it is goodbye for now." Dan didn't argue. He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for everything." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked upstairs, the weight of his words pressing heavily on my shoulders. Packing was harder than I anticipated. Every item I placed in my suitcase felt like another thread unraveling, another piece of the life I was leaving behind. But with each item, I also felt a small sense of liberation, a step closer to finding myself again. When I was done, I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, taking one last look around. This room had been a sanctuary once, a place of love and intimacy. But now it felt like a hollow shell, a reminder of what I had lost. I carried my bags downstairs where Dan was waiting by the door. He didn't say anything, but his eyes conveyed everything he was feeling: regret, sadness, and perhaps a hint of hope. I paused, my hand on the doorknob. "Take care of yourself, Dan," I said softly. "You too," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I stepped outside, the cool air hitting my face like a breath of fresh life. As I loaded my bags into the car, I felt a strange mix of emotions. grief for what I was leaving behind, but also a quiet sense of freedom. When I arrived back at Marcus's apartment, he was waiting for me at the door. He took one look at me and pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as the weight of the day. "It's done," I said, my voice muffled against his chest. I told him I'm leaving. Marcus pulled back, his hands resting on my shoulders. "How do you feel?" "Sad," I admitted, but also relieved. He nodded, his expression understanding. "You're doing the right thing." I looked up at him, his steady presence grounding me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again, and as he leaned down to kiss me, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was finally finding my way back to myself. The days following my return to Marcus's apartment were both freeing and disorienting. It was strange to wake up in a place that wasn't my home, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel the crushing weight of expectation. Marcus gave me space when I needed it, never pushing for answers or decisions, and we found an easy rhythm together. Mornings filled with coffee and quiet conversation, afternoons spent apart while he worked from home and I began sorting through my tangled emotions. In the evenings, we'd settle on the couch, watching movies or sharing stories about our pasts. The simplicity of it was here, but the calm couldn't last forever. One evening, as Marcus and I sat together after dinner, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at the screen, my stomach tightening when I saw Dan's name. Marcus noticed the shift in my expression. "You don't have to answer it," he said gently. "I know," I replied, picking up the phone anyway. "But I should." I swiped to answer, my heart pounding. "Hello? Hey." Dan's voice came through, tentative. "I wasn't sure if you'd pick up." "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. I've been thinking about what you said," he began, "about needing time and space. I get it, and I want to respect that. But there's something I need to tell you." The seriousness in his tone made my stomach drop. "What is it?" Dan hesitated, and for a moment I thought he might change his mind, but then he let out a heavy sigh. "It's about Christine." Of course it was. My grip on the phone tightened. "What about her?" "We ended things," he said quietly. "I told her it was over. She wasn't worth losing you." His words should have brought me relief, but instead, they felt hollow. Ending things with Christine didn't erase the betrayal or undo the damage that had already been done. "I'm glad you made that decision," I said carefully. "But that doesn't change where we are, Dan. It doesn't change what happened." "I know," he admitted, "but I want you to know that I'm trying, that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this." I closed my eyes, leaning back against the couch. "It's not that simple." "I know it's not," he said quickly, "but I'm not giving up on us. Even if you need time, even if you're not ready to come back, I'm not giving up." The sincerity in his voice tugged at my heart, but it also frustrated me. Where was this version of Dan months ago, when I was silently crying out for him to notice me? Why did it take losing me for him to realize what he had? "Dan," I said softly, "I appreciate what you're saying, but I can't make any promises right now. I need to focus on myself, and I need you to respect." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then he sighed. "I understand. Just don't forget that I love you, okay?" "I won't," I said, though the words felt like a distant echo of a life I was no longer living. We ended the call, and I set the phone down, my hands trembling. Marcus watched me carefully, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded, though my emotions were a tangled mess. "He ended things with Christine." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And how does that make you feel?" "Confused," I admitted. "Part of me feels like it's too little too late, but another part of me wonders if we could actually fix things." Marcus didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back, his gaze steady. You don't owe him a decision right now. Take the time you need to figure out what's best for you. His support was exactly what I needed, but it also stirred a sense of guilt. Marcus had been nothing but patient and kind, yet I was still tethered to the remnants of my marriage, unable to fully let go. I didn't know how to reconcile the two. The days turned into weeks, and slowly I began to reclaim pieces of myself I thought I'd lost. I started journaling again, pouring my thoughts onto the page in a way that felt cathartic and freeing. I took long walks, letting the crisp autumn air clear my mind, and through it all, Marcus was there, steady, supportive, and never demanding more than I could give. But as much as I was healing, the shadow of my marriage loomed over me. I couldn't ignore the pull to confront it, to face it head on and decide whether to let it go for good or try to rebuild. One afternoon, as I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea, Marcus joined me, pulling up a chair beside me. He didn't say anything at first, simply watching the trees sway in the breeze. You've been quiet today, he said finally, his tone gentle. Just thinking, I replied, staring down at the mug in my hands. I hope Dan. I nodded, appreciating that he didn't sound accusatory or jealous. I keep wondering if I'm making the right choice, if walking away means I'm giving up too easily. You're not giving up, Marcus said firmly. You're choosing yourself, and that's not something to feel guilty about. But what if I regret it? I asked, my voice breaking. What if I walk away and realize I made a mistake? Marcus reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. Then you'll face it, just like you're facing everything else. But I don't think you will. I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. His words brought tears to my eyes, but they also brought clarity. I couldn't keep living in limbo, torn between two lives. It was time to make a choice. That evening, I called Dan and asked to meet. He suggested the house, but I refused. I needed neutral ground, a place where I could speak my truth without the weight of our shared history pressing down on me. We met at a quiet cafe, the same one where Marcus had first shown me the messages. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dan was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table near the window. He stood when he saw me, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. Thanks for meeting me, he said as I sat down. I think we need to talk, I said, folding my hands on the table. Really talk. He nodded, leaning forward. I'm ready. For the next hour, we laid everything bare. I told him about the loneliness, the resentment, and the ways his actions had broken my trust. He listened, his eyes filled with regret, but he didn't interrupt. When it was his turn, he admitted to the pressure he'd felt, the mistakes he'd made, and the ways he had taken me for granted. By the end of the conversation, we were both emotionally drained, but there was also a sense of resolution, a mutual understanding that while we cared deeply for each other, the damage might be too great to repair. I don't think I can come back, I said softly, my voice trembling. Not right now. Dan's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but he nodded. I understand. And as much as it hurts, I want you to be happy, even if that means without me. His words brought a lump to my throat, but they also brought peace. For the first time in months, I felt like we were on the same page, even if that page marked the end of our story. When I returned to Marcus's apartment that night, he didn't ask how the conversation went. Instead, he pulled me into his arms and held me close, letting his steady presence speak for itself. And as I rested my head against his chest, I realized that I wasn't just closing a chapter, I was starting a new one. One evening, as we sat on my balcony watching the sunset, Marcus turned to me with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever think about the future? He asked. All the time, I said with a smile. He hesitated, as though weighing his words carefully. I just want to make sure we're on the same page. I don't want to push you, but I care about you more than I ever thought possible." His vulnerability took me by surprise, and I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. I care about you too," I said, "and I see a future with you. But I also need to make sure I'm ready to be the best version of myself before I commit to anything serious." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand, and I'm willing to wait for as long as it takes." His patience and understanding made me fall for him even more, and I knew then that we were building something real, something worth waiting for. As the weeks turned into months, I continued to grow into my new life. Dan and I finalized our separation amicably, and though it was bittersweet, I knew it was the right decision for both of us. We parted on good terms, with a mutual respect that had been absent for far too long. My relationship with Marcus deepened, built on a foundation of trust and understanding. He became my partner in every sense of the word, and together we began to dream of a future that was filled with possibility. Looking back, I realized that the journey I had been on, the heartbreak, the mistakes, the moments of doubt, had all led me to this place. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as I sat with Marcus, his arm wrapped around me as we watched the city lights below, I knew I had found something I hadn't thought possible: peace. Months passed, and life began to settle into a rhythm I hadn't experienced in years. My apartment, once a chaotic sea of boxes, had become a sanctuary, a place that felt wholly mine. Every piece of furniture, every photo on the wall was a reflection of who I was becoming. And while there were still moments of doubt, I found myself growing more confident in the choices I had made. Marcus remained a steady presence in my life. His patience, understanding, and unwavering support were the foundation upon which I was rebuilding myself. Our relationship grew stronger, but it was free of the pressure I had felt in my marriage. For once, I didn't feel like I had to perform or fit into a mold. I could simply be. One Saturday morning, Marcus surprised me with an idea. "Let's get out of the city," he said over breakfast. "Just for the day. You've been working so hard on everything. Your job, your apartment, yourself. You deserve a break." I hesitated, swirling my coffee as I considered it. "Where would we go?" "There's a hiking trail about an hour from here," he said, his eyes lighting up. "It's quiet, beautiful, and exactly what you need." The thought of escaping the noise of the city, even for a few hours, was appealing. "Okay," I said, smiling. "Let's do it." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth spread through me. "I wouldn't have made it this far without you," I admitted. He leaned closer, his gaze steady. "Maybe, but you did the hard part. You chose yourself." I smiled, reaching for his hand. "And I chose you." As my relationship with Marcus deepened, I began to see him in a new light. He wasn't just the man who had been there when I needed someone most. He was becoming someone I could truly envision a future with. But that future came with challenges, namely, the complicated dynamics of his relationship with Dan. Dan and I had managed to maintain a cordial relationship since our separation, but I knew the truth about Marcus and me would complicate things. The thought of confronting that reality made my stomach twist. One evening, as Marcus and I sat together on the balcony, I broached the subject. "Have you talked to Dan?" I asked carefully. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not about us. I didn't want to make things harder for you." "I appreciate that," I said, "but I think it's time. He deserves to know." Marcus nodded, though his jaw tightened. "You're right. I'll talk to him." "Do you think he'll hate us?" I asked, the weight of the question heavy in the air. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but I'd rather he hear it from me than find out some other way." The conversation with Dan happened sooner than I expected. A few days later, Marcus called me, his voice tense but steady. "I talked to him," he said. "And?" I asked, holding my breath. "He wasn't happy," Marcus admitted, "but he didn't explode like I thought he might. He said he needed time to process." I nodded, relief and apprehension mingling in my chest. "I guess that's all we can ask for." "Exactly," Marcus said. "But no matter what, we're in this together." His reassurance steadied me, and I realized that while the road ahead might be complicated, I wasn't walking it alone. Years later, as I sat on the porch of our home watching Clara and James chase each other through the yard, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Marcus joined me, his hand slipping into mine as we watched our children play. "We've done all right, haven't we?" he said, a smile tugging at his lips. "We have," I agreed, leaning my head against his shoulder. "Better than all right." As I sat there, surrounded by the love we had built, I realized that life wasn't about perfection or following a predetermined path. It was about finding the courage to take risks, to let go of what no longer served you, and to embrace the beauty of the unexpected. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the world, I knew that this was exactly where I was meant to be.